it's undeniable that Zion, again, appears in the Bible, as you just referenced, over and over, and it becomes symbolic of the glory of Israel, with God at the center.
Sure.
And so they're remembering, for example, probably the best illustration of this, one of the high points would be when Solomon dedicated the temple. And he's praying, and God was he was glorified. There was a lot of sacrifices that were going on, and God was glorified in the eyes of the people. At that moment, there was less, let's say not there was none, less idolatry. God was glorified. And so people have this image of Zion, but specifically referring to Jerusalem and its broader category of kingdom-mindedness, for example, again, in the land of Israel. And, I'm just going to put it right out of the gate, is that I think I've seen errors on both sides, Gary, in this. I've seen those that are in kind of the replacement theologians. I'm talking about Christians. And I've seen them they can become anti-Zionist or anti-Israel, modern Israel. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then on the other side, you have Christians that have been raised like Ted Cruz. What he said, when I was a kid in church, Genesis 12:3. So now he has this idea, and some Christians are so pro-Israel that I think that's to a fault. Can you be too pro-Israel? I say absolutely you can, but we need to define that.
Sure. Now, let me read this before you begin that definition. Dr. Matthew Mavick, we both have his investigation. I don't know what you call it, but an explanation of what modern Zionism happens to be. And he opens with, during a recent interview with Tucker Carlson, U.S. Senator Ted Cruz displayed not only alarming geopolitical ignorance, but a brazen willingness to distort Scripture. Now that says it all. It puts it right out there where you can talk about it. But when I think about geopolitics, reading my Bible and thinking about Israel, ancient Israel and regathered Israel today, Zion is Zion in my mind, and certainly it is in theirs.
Yes, and his title is How Christian Zionism Distorts Scripture to Serve Empire. Why America's Blessed Israel Obsession Risks the Church, the World, and the Truth. So I don't really know much about Dr. Matthew here, but if you read this article, you can tell that he has his own bias.
Yes.
But he does bring up some fair points, which again, the goal in anything is to be able to understand both sides of the perspective and to find the truth. You have two extremes. Again, I think there's two extremes in the church. I think there's extreme anti-Israel, and I think there's extreme pro-Israel. And but the goal is to define what that means. And one of the books that we have here, that Dr. Tommy Ice, he wrote a book called Christian Zionism: The Case for Zionism. And so, he comes from it from his perspective of the Scripture for sure. But let's talk about this definition so that we can all understand what it means. There on page 28, you want to read that, Gary? Just the Zionism, just the first paragraph on the Zionism part, because there's Christian Zionism, but let's just talk about Zionism in general.
Zionism is understood to mean a modern Jewish movement aiming at resettlement in the land of Israel and the revival of an independent Jewish nation. Obviously, the word Zionism is derived from the biblical word Zion, used 163 times in the Bible, 156 in the Old Testament, and 7 times in the New Testament. So we have here a biblical establishment of Zion. All that's left is to define it.
Yes.
And by the way, that's not easy.
If you look out, like with pieces like this, or again, these other people, they have muddied the waters, where I think it actually is pretty straightforward, because one of the things that Tommy Ice says here is that, as you read in Psalm 137, they were longing for the homeland. They were in Babylon, so they're longing. And so you have this longing over the last 2,000 years, roughly, between the time that Israel was kicked out of the land in 70 AD. So that being the case, the Jews wherever God scattered them, because it was a judgment for their rejection of Jesus. That's very clear. We see that in many passages, Luke 21, Luke 19. But as they were scattered, they longed to come back to the homeland. Okay, so with Theodor Herzl in 1897, as he begins to try to regather the idea of returning to the homeland, which again is in the land of Israel, what we call the Levant, the Middle East, etc. But remember, he was not religious. Theodor Herzl was not a religious man.
That's true.
So for him, it wasn't this religious thing. It was just, hey, let's bring the Jews back, because he recognized that throughout church history, or not even church history, for the last 2,000 years, the Jews had a lot of struggle mostly everywhere they went. They were ostracized. There was a lot of pogroms. There's, of course, we know this was before World War II even in 1897. So he's just thinking, let's get a homeland where the Jews can come back to where they were. And in fact, this is kind of funny in one sense, he didn't even care if it was in the land of Israel as that we know it. He said, he even was willing to take it in Uganda. Okay, so the Jews could come back as long as they had their own homeland. Okay, but let's go to Christian Zionism for a minute, because he says, Tommy I says, today Zionism encompasses anyone for any reason desiring to see the nation of Israel continue as a Jewish state and to prosper. Okay, so that's kind of the generic Zionism. But would you mind reading the Christian Zionism definition?
Christian Zionism is a religious belief among some Gentiles of the Christian faith that the return of the Jews to the Holy Land and the restoration of a physical Israel is in accordance with biblical prophecy. And here we end on two interesting words, biblical prophecy, because we are prophecy watchers. We're very interested in prophecy. And so our view of Zionism is going to be based on that, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. And it's not even so much that that we are we're creating it, because this is something that we believe that God was doing regardless of what evangelical Christians, because evangelical Christians back then weren't necessarily Zionists. Zionism as a definition now looks back at what God has done and says, okay, how do we do this? And he says, furthermore, Christian Zionism is motivated by a biblically based religious conviction that the Jewish people are still God's chosen people and are entitled to possess the land of Israel for all time. This belief is based on specific interpretation of Scripture. Goes on and on and on. But the key thing there, and this is important, Gary, is still God's chosen people. Now, I was talking to somebody again this last weekend, and we were talking about is Israel, is the nation Israel, even modern Israel today, are they God's chosen people? And I said, of course. And then immediately he said, but look at the way that they live. And I said, wait a minute. Are you confusing the idea of chosenness as being saved?
Yeah.
And he goes, well, yeah. And I go, whoa. If you look at, and I said, listen, this is where I think we're living in biblical days, Gary, because if you go back to the book of Judges, they were in the land, they're God's chosen people. It says, in those days, there was no king in Israel, and everybody did what was right in their own eyes.
Exactly.
And you go to Judges, 16, and they're cutting up concubines and pieces and sending them around. I mean, you just read the book of Judges, you're like, oh, wow. But you look at how wicked and evil and just lost these individuals were, these Jewish people, but they were still God's chosen people. All chosen means is separated.
Designated.
Yes, they're designated, and they were God's people. They were in a covenant relationship with them. But it doesn't mean the individuals were saved.
They didn't respond to the covenant.
No, they didn't live up. They didn't live up to the covenant.
But God did not break the covenant.
And that was my next question: is did God cast off His people back then because they were wicked? No. When Assyria came and took the northern kingdom in 722 BC, did they get cast off as no, he took them out of the land, but they never lost their separateness or their chosenness. But again, that's the problem. So when it says here, they have a religious Christian Zionists believe that the Jewish people are still God's chosen people. That doesn't mean that they're saved. It means that the promises are still theirs.